Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Kind of a different time for us here. It's a holiday. It's Martin Luther King Day, January 16th. Important to me personally because of Martin Luther King, a hero of mine, obviously, but also the night of January 16th, my high school play, an Ayn Rand play. Believe it or not, yeah, that Ayn Rand wrote this play, the night of January 16th. Really cool play. And of course, that's where we are today, January 16th. The premise of that play, by the way, was it was a jury trial, basically, that you tried in front of a live audience. You pooled the crowd before the show each night. That's where you got the jury. And then you tried the case. It'd be a great time to bring that idea back because of the polarization of America on so many issues, and particularly politics. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today with our guest that's coming back on the Podcast by George LiveLine. Man, I really like this guy right out of The Guardian, folks. It's Chris McGreal. He writes for The Guardian U.S. He's a former Guardian correspondent in Washington, Johannesburg, and Jerusalem. He's the author of American Overdose. We talked to him about that book on Podcast by George, an earlier episode. You can find that on my website. That's The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. And he just authored an article entitled Trump's Political Fate May Have Been Decided by a Georgia Grand Jury. Yeah, the Teflon Don, folks, may have run out of Teflon. So let me bring that off the screen. A couple of things here I want to get to real quick on Martin Luther King Day. I'll bring this up on screen because I love this. This is the great Jim Earl, writer out of the left coast out there that I like to cite once in a while. He made a great point on Twitter. He says, I like to commemorate every Martin Luther King Jr. Day by remembering all the refreshingly radical socialist things Democrats and Republicans refuse to remember him saying. And that's great. And that's a great thing to remember because the legacy of the great Dr. Martin Luther King, we're still not doing it. We're still not following him when it comes to issues of racism and income inequality in America. He was a great voice on anti-war and all of those things. And sometimes it seems to me that we haven't progressed. It seems to me like we've gotten forward. The other thing I wanted to bring up on screen here very quickly, but as we start, having to do with Martin Luther King, seeing a lot of reporting, maybe more than normal this year. And again, it might have to do with this polarization of America. But this year, a lot of people are saying that Martin Luther King was shot down, maybe not by James Earl Ray at all, that he was killed by our government. The conspiracy theorists are out in full flight. And I want to bring this clip on because I posted this on my web pages on Facebook. And it's the great Gerald Posner who authored the book Case Closed, one of the definitive books on the JFK assassination. And this isn't very long, but it's worth watching because I asked him specifically about the assassination of Martin Luther King outside the Lorraine Motel, or on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, and James Earl Ray's involvement in that. And unlike the Kennedy assassination, where no credible evidence has ever been found of a conspiracy other than one lone nut being Lee Harvey Oswald, there is some belief that maybe there was what has been referred to as a kitchen table conspiracy, or maybe a barroom, backroom conspiracy when it comes to Martin Luther King. I asked him about it, and this is Gerald's response.
Yeah, I think there was a bounty. The House Select Committee got this right. There was a number of bounties on King. The Ray brothers, I show you how one of the brothers who ran a bar found out about one of the bounties of $50,000 out of St. Louis and passed that information on to Ray in Christmas of '67. Ray then suddenly goes from a guy who's taking dance lessons and taking lessons to become a bartender. He's on the run from the feds because he escaped from prison, into buying a gun and starting to track King. And so the one thing for sure is he didn't collect any of the bounty after the assassination. And we know that because when he got to Canada, he was about $100 short of getting to Rhodesia on an airfare. That's where he wanted to go, White Run, Rhodesia, or South Africa. So he had to go to England instead. And the one thing is, I was so happy when I came out with that book in '98, because I thought, I finally found a conspiracy. It's a small kitchen conspiracy. It's Ray's brothers and family, I think, although they never were charged with the crime. But that's not what people thought a conspiracy was. I found that out afterwards. They think of a conspiracy as meaning something much grander, not what I think of it as a lawyer, a group of people who may have been involved in killing the president. I would think it's a conspiracy if Oswald was helped by 1 or 2 or 3 other people. But people think conspiracy means a Oliver Stone type conspiracy, hundreds of people inside the secret government or someplace like that, pulling off the crime and keeping it secret.
So that's the great Gerald Posner, Pulitzer nominated author and favorite of mine. And you can take what that guy says to the bank, folks. I mean, I believe him. He knows what he's talking about. He's meticulous in his research, and that's his perspective on the killing of Martin Luther King. And it's really important, these things. People, well, it's just something on TV or it's just a conspiracy. Nah, man, these conspiracy theories are really important because if you believe that shadowy figures of your own government are around killing John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, man, does that change your perspective? And yeah, I mean, read the books, do the research, look into it. But that is the great Gerald Posner. Let's go to today's topic now. We're going to talk to another great author here. This guy's a friend of mine. I haven't had him on for quite a while, so let's see if we can bring. There he is. So, hi, Chris McGreal from The Guardian. Welcome back to the Podcast by George LiveLine.
Hi, George.
Okay, thanks for coming on, pal. So, it has been a while since you've been on, and you are all things political. You cover you are the U.S. correspondent for The Guardian in the United States. You and I first met at a John Hickenlooper event, I think in 2016 in the run-up for that election. He was running for president, and that guy is now a U.S. senator from Colorado. And I don't know, you probably don't think of Hickenlooper this way, but I do. He's the guy that drank the fracking fluid, right?
Well, indeed. I will point out that I'm actually one of the Guardian correspondents. There's hordes of us here.
Okay, yeah.
So much interest in America. I'm not but I'm certainly one of them, yes. And I do tend to wander around the country quite a bit, including Hickenlooper's presidential bid, which, if I remember right, didn't last very long.
No, and I've kind of lost track of him. Like I said, he's a U.S. senator from Colorado, so I shouldn't lose track of him. He's a Democrat, so you would think that I would favor him, but he's really, even on some issues, leading towards the conservative side of the slate, and that fracking thing is a perfect example. I mean, I'm anti-fracking. We got to find a way around this stuff ASAP because of the climate, and he's a supporter of that. It's big in Colorado. There's a lot of money vested in drilling and fracking out in Colorado. So he was a supporter of that. But my God, I don't want to talk about John Hickenlooper. I want to talk about this guy. Let me bring this up on screen here. This is out of The Guardian, your most recent writings here. Trump's political fate may have been decided by a Georgia grand jury. Chris, I don't talk about Donald Trump a lot on my show. I actually talk about Democrats more, probably criticizing them because I think there's more room maybe to get them to move, although they haven't proven it that way lately. But, I just don't look at attacking Donald Trump or the Republicans on my show because they don't watch my show by and large, probably. But I also just don't think it will do any good. But boy, my viewers do. And they think sometimes I'm kind of supporting Trump or something. And I'm not. I mean, I don't like this guy. I refer to him as Captain Butt Crunch on the show. The little subdeck here says a panel that considered whether ex-president committed crimes in trying to overturn the 2020 election defeat could recommend prosecution down in Georgia. Now, this isn't just hopeful thinking. This is a possibility here. Here's what Chris writes. He says, even as Donald Trump prepares to dial up his campaign to take back the White House, the former U.S. president's political and personal fate may already have been decided by the secret workings of a grand jury in Georgia. Okay, so full stop there. We better explain that grand juries are secret. I mean, there's nothing nefarious underway here. Explain what's taking place down there in Georgia with the grand jury, Chris.
Well, the reason I use secret workings is you have to bear in mind that often my articles are for an international audience and they don't necessarily understand how grand juries work. Yeah. So all of this is, as you say, quite legitimately done behind closed doors. What's been going on in Georgia is a little unusual. The district attorney of Fulton County, which basically is Atlanta, Fannie Willis, she convened a special grand jury there, and they're not very often put together in Georgia. But a special grand jury is different to a regular grand jury, principally in that it can sit for very much longer. It can sit for up to a year. It has additional powers to subpoena, to call for evidence. But what it doesn't do is have the power to indict. So Fannie Willis convened this special grand jury to look into Trump's actions in Georgia immediately following the 2020 vote. You know, at the time when it looked as though Georgia might actually decide the outcome of the election.
Yeah.
Things transpired in the days and weeks that followed, but it was certainly a key player in all of that. And he, along with, you know, some of his closest allies and lawyers, Rudolph Giuliani in particular springs to mind, put the squeeze on Georgia officials, essentially to change the result. Trump had lost by 11,780 votes, and he wanted to find.
Just find him.
Essentially, this grand jury was put together to look into that in great detail and come up with a recommendation as to whether he should be prosecuted. If that recommendation were made, then Willis could take that to a regular grand jury and get an indictment if she felt so inclined.
Let me get back to the article here. Now, it's very lengthy. I encourage everybody to go to The Guardian and read it in depth, read it in its entirety. But we're going to hit the high points here of the open. The 23-member panel convened to consider whether Trump and others committed crimes in trying to overturn his defeat in Georgia when it appeared the state might decide the outcome of the entire 2020 presidential election. Was dissolved on Monday after submitting its conclusions and asking that they be made public. Now, if the grand jury's report recommends prosecution, a county district attorney in Atlanta, this Fani Willis that Chris is talking about, will face the most consequential decision of her career, whether for the first time in American history to charge a former president with a criminal offense. And so talk a little bit about the vibe down there in Georgia, that state. It's split. Geez, it seems like by a few thousand votes, right down the middle between Democrat and Republican. So does that factor into this? Is Georgia the kind of state where this kind of thing can result, or is that going to play a role, how evenly split it is politically?
Well, it's worth, bearing in mind that this investigation is taking place in Fulton County, which, as I said, is mostly Atlanta. And Atlanta is not nearly as split as Georgia overall. It voted overwhelmingly for Biden. It is not what you would describe as Trump territory. And a jury would be drawn from within Fulton County were this to go to trial. So in that sense, it's not quite as evenly balanced as it would be if a jury were to be drawn from across the state. Having said that, I think one of the things that's become clear over the past year or so, as this investigation has proceeded, actually, I should say that the investigation began 2 years ago, way back when the evidence first emerged of Trump kind of pressuring Georgia officials, particularly the state secretary of state, to fix the election. But after a year of looking into it, Willis's office decided to ask for this special grand jury. It worked for 8 months. And I think that one of the things that's become clear, if you look at the huge number of people that she called to give testimony, including some who went very reluctantly, like Giuliani and Senator Lindsey Graham, she is trying to put together the most solid case possible, I think, to override this issue of division, of people who might be sympathetic to Trump feeling that the case isn't there. It would seem that we don't know what was said inside the grand jury because it works in secrecy. But if you look at the people that were called and the issues that they must have been asked to address, because we know what their actions were now, they've been made public. I think that she's obviously trying to put together this absolutely watertight case that even a juror who was prepared to give Trump the benefit of the doubt to find ways to let him off would actually find it very hard to do. I think that has been the purpose of the special grand jury. If she just used a regular grand jury, she would just have had a few weeks to do that. And it's clear that the case would not have been as solid as it seems she's tried to put together.
Yeah, the law and legalities and politics are supposed to be separate. Are they going to be able to keep these separate down there? And here's what I'm thinking as an example. Are I remember when Obama took office, there was a lot of calls from the left for him to prosecute George W. Bush, do something to him for those weapons of mass destruction and the false flag in Iraq and that type of thing. And Obama kind of stood back and said, that's going to inflame the country. That's going to be a really bad situation. I don't want to make a bad situation worse by pursuing this. And it just went for wanting. Well, when it comes to somebody on the law, like this, the woman that you're talking about there, is she going to be able to separate law from politics, or are they always going to be intrinsically entwined? And in this particular case as well.
Well, whether we like it or not, I think the prosecution of Donald Trump for anything at all would be seen as incredibly political. There's no way around that. She's also an elected Democrat, and that will weigh on how some people at least see her motives for pursuing this and the prosecution in general. I mean, one of the people I spoke to for the article is a former White House special counsel called Norman Eisen, who put together a report for the Brookings Institute, which said that it was highly likely that Trump was going to be prosecuted. There's overwhelming evidence against him. And Eisen described it. He said this would be momentous if he were to be prosecuted. He said it's momentous in part because of Trump's actions. Never before have we seen a president try and mount a coup to stay in power. But it's also momentous because it's a defense of American democracy and the rule of law. So, yeah, there's no doubt that it would be momentous, and there's no doubt that it would be seen as highly political, but perhaps a little like the impeachment of Richard Nixon, which was certainly to begin with seen as nothing but political. As it proceeded, as the evidence came out, as more and more America understood what had gone on, there was more of a sense that there had to be some kind of justice for this, that there had to be some accountability. And it may be that, particularly if there was a trial and the evidence is produced, that America's opinion will shift.
I'm an old lefty, and I'm a cynic. And talking about Nixon, and then talking about George W. With those weapons of mass destruction, they didn't bring him down. That didn't ruin his presidency. That didn't result in a conviction. But Nixon had to resign, ran out of office, basically. And this was the guy that had illegally invaded Cambodia and Laos. He had extended the Vietnam War, had this secret plan that he was going to conceal until he got it was just unbelievable what he was doing in the arena of foreign affairs and in war. But what got him was this minor burglary, they call it, at Watergate. But it was screwing with the system, the foundation, the fundamental of the American electoral process, which in my world maybe is not as big as a war, but in the world of the feds, as an example, it's huge. Well, fast forward now to what Trump did. And you talk about his role in the coup and his attempt to change these votes in Georgia and other places. You think, well, they're not going to get him on that, but they might. It might be something that could bring him down even still. Do you think of it in those terms?
Yeah, I mean, as has long been said about the whole Nixon era, yes, there were these international crimes, but that's a much harder thing to prosecute in the United States. There's considerable division over foreign policy and over the Vietnam War, and as it was with Iraq and Afghanistan and George W. Bush, domestically it's a lot more clear cut. It would seem, on the basis of what we already know, certainly on the basis of what a lot of lawyers have looked at quite closely, that yes, there were indeed laws that were broken. I mean, there is a tape of Donald Trump pressuring the Georgia Secretary of State to find those votes. It's a very clear hour-long tape. It's a very damning piece of evidence, and it's out there for people to hear. And I think that that kind of thing would be very persuasive to people, including a jury. So yes, it could be. I mean, one of the things that Fani Willis is quite known for as a district attorney is she quite likes the RICO, anti-racketeering laws. In fact, she used the Georgia version against some school teachers who had fixed exam results in order to look better, and sent them off. I think some of them went to prison for it. And she's clearly, part of what she's doing, because of the wording of some of the things she's said in public, she's clearly looking to put together a conspiracy case, amongst other things, that there wasn't just Donald Trump picked up the phone and had a go, that Giuliani and others were sitting there with him on calls, or were making calls on his behalf, following up calls. They were working together, and she sees a conspiracy there. Again, that may be persuasive to a jury if she's able to show how they work together over a number of weeks, repeatedly pressuring different officials. And one of the interesting things is that one of those officials, the Georgia Secretary of State guy called Brad Raffensperger, he wrote a book about this. And he says clearly, he's a Republican who voted for Trump, by the way, but he says clearly that there was a concerted effort over a number of weeks to pressure him to fix the election result, to find these votes. When you've got it coming from a man like him, I think that probably would also be quite persuasive.
Let's talk about RICO a little bit. I'm glad you brought that up, because the Department of Justice, the feds, they've been running around chasing the mob for years, for decades. They didn't have a lot of success. These guys, the Teflon Don that we talked about, this RICO, anti-racketeering legislation, that's what brought them down. And that's interesting that you mentioned that she's a big fan of using that, because if you listen to that tape, and I've heard segments of it that you're talking about, that hour-long tape, that sounds like a strong arm. It sounds like a mobster talking to a potential victim. They speak in terms of, I think you want to do this. I think it really would be in your best interest to do this. I need you just to find these votes that I'm, this wording, the way that this thing flows, it sounds like something, right out of the annals of mob history in the United States. And the fact that she could use this RICO stuff to bring Trump down, I mean, that's fascinating. That's, that's a coincidence not to be missed here.
Well, it's worth reading some of what Trump actually said. And one of the when Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, resists the pressure to find these votes, says, look, the data doesn't show it, I'm not going to do it, kind of thing. At some point, Trump says to him, and this is the quote, all of this stuff is very dangerous stuff when you talk about no criminality. I think it's very dangerous for you to say that. And Raffensperger says in his book, I felt then, and I still believe today, that was a threat. And so in terms of what you're talking about, RICO and threats and all the rest, clearly the man on the receiving end of that saw it as a threat. And he said, actually, it did generate a lot of threats to him, particularly death threats on, text messaging and phone calls and things.
Wow. Well, I haven't heard that tape. I've read little snippets of it, like Chris is talking about. Let me bring this back up on screen here, because we got to keep moving here. Let me see. Here it is. Okay. So this last thing that I highlighted, for the first time in American history, to charge a former president with a criminal offense. Okay. The reason I highlighted that, I wanted to kind of get your take, your feel kind of on this again, Chris. If she were to do this, if this were to work, if he were to be charged, if he were to be convicted, for instance, I mean, we've already seen these people with their asses hanging out, crawling through the windows of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, a year past. What would happen? I mean, do you have any sense or feeling, just based on the politicians and the electorate that you encounter? I mean, could this do more harm than good at this point?
I think it's hard to know what would happen, right? I actually think that it would depend on what evidence came out in the trial, and if it's overwhelming and persuasive. I think January 6th perhaps is a little bit of an indicator. Is look how many people backed away from that in the end, and it has been possible to send quite a lot of people to prison, and there are very few people in the Republican Party now who publicly defended what happened. I think if you were to see overwhelming evidence, if they've got it, the testimony of all kinds of people. One of the things we don't know is what kind of deals might be being offered. The Georgia investigation, of course, is focused on what happened in Georgia, but there's also the federal investigation, and that includes basically the conspiracy across the country. This wasn't only going on in Georgia. He was making calls to other places too, like Arizona, and then you have his actions that led up to January 6th, all of which is being looked at by the Justice Department. So, and on top of that, of course, we have the January 6th committee's report, which, as some lawyers have said, actually provides pretty solid evidence on its own of criminal acts. And so I think, again, I go back to, it depends how things unfold. If you had, a very public reckoning where all this evidence is out there, particularly if you have credible officials like the Georgia Secretary of State, like the Georgia governor, both Republicans, saying, yes, this was, a move to get us to rig the election results. We don't know what else they found out. We don't know what's in a lot of the text messages and a lot of the emails. They put together a really solid case. I'm not convinced that most Americans are going to want to stand by Donald Trump in those circumstances. But, it has been, who would have predicted the path that, Trumpian politics, for want of a better term, has followed over recent years. So who knows?
He's probably got a small core that will always stick with him, but I think some of those are already fleeing. I don't know, maybe it's a sinking ship and they're just going to go launch onto somebody like DeSantis or somebody else that can, feed their unique perspective on the world. Okay, so I wanted to bring this up because when I read Chris's writing here, this article, and the conviction of a president, the possible jailing of a president, I was thinking of this, and let me bring this up on screen here. This is a great Vincent Bugliosi. It dovetails very nicely with what we were talking about with the conspiracy theories, ML King, John Kennedy earlier. He wrote the definitive work on the John Kennedy assassination. His magnus opus, he called it. 1,600 pages this book was. But this book that he wrote earlier is The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder by Vincent Bugliosi. He's that DA, that account out of Los Angeles. He's the guy that convicted Charlie Manson and wrote the book Helter Skelter. And then here's his book, Reclaiming History, 1,600 pages, and it's got a CD with it as well. If you want to be an expert on the Kennedy assassination and know every angle and look at this thing possible, get this book. I have read every page of it. Now, this is out of Wikipedia. I'm not a huge Wikipedia fan, but this is one of the few places I could find this. It says the strongest evidence against Bush, according to Bugliosi, was a speech in October 7th, 2002, claiming that Iraq posed an imminent threat to the security of the United States and that Hussein was capable of attacking America at any time with his stockpile of weapons of mass destruction. A national intelligence estimate of less than a week earlier said that while Iraq did have WMD capabilities, it had no plans to use its weapons except in the capacity of self-defense or if the United States threatened to attack Iraq. Bugliosi said that the president and his administration edited the white paper or classified version of the NIE released to Congress and the public in order to present the Iraqi threat as more serious than it was in fact. Now, throughout this book, Bugliosi, God rest in peace, Vincent. He died at age 80, folks, because of cancer. He castigates Bush for what Bugliosi says is his callous and cavalier attitude regarding the deaths and suffering of American soldiers. And Vincent also talked about the innocent civilians. He noted from his investigation that Bush had spent a total of 2.5 of his years in presidency as various vacation spots. So he was on vacation 2.5 years of his presidency outside Washington, D.C., places such as Camp Davis and his Texas ranch. In addition, Bugliosi asserted that in the Manning memo, showing that far from making serious efforts to avoid war, Bush considered the possibility of provoking Saddam into starting a war by sending U-2 reconnaissance aircraft falsely painted in UN colors on flights over Iraq, along with fighter escorts. mean, this is just really, I mean, it's hard to get people to understand what's going on here. And this isn't conspiracy stuff. This memo, this Manning memo, this was reported in The Guardian, I believe. That's where I saw some of the reporting on this. I want to play this clip here, and we're going to, this is just going to take a minute. We'll come right back here to Chris, but this is really good. Now, this is the great Vincent Bugliosi.
Although I don't have myself any clout, I got the clout of an emaciated moth. I'm no longer associated with law enforcement. Within days, I'm going to be reaching out to prosecutors throughout this land, looking for a courageous prosecutor who does have the clout, who does have the authority to prosecute George Bush for murder. And I'll be starting out by sending a copy of my book with a cover letter from me to each of the 50 attorney generals throughout this country. I'll be asking them to read the book, and if they agree with me that the evidence of Bush's guilt is clear and that there's jurisdiction to proceed against him criminally, I'm also offering my services in whatever way the prosecutor sees fit. Could be all the way from an accountant up to and including being appointed a special prosecutor. If justice means anything at all in America, and if we're not going to forget about these 4,000 young American soldiers who came back from Bush's war in a box, I say we have no choice but to bring murder charges against the son of privilege from Crawford, Texas. Thank you.
Yeah, and some estimates are as high as 1 million innocent civilians. I talk all the time about the men, women, children, little bitty babies that died in that war under a false pretense, under a false flag, because of weapons of mass destruction. It's been proven they did not exist. Well, that was great by Vincent. It was a great book. And, he was never one to shy away from the limelight, and it got him a lot of it, actually. But nobody was going to take that case up. Nobody did. I mean, he went to his grave, I think, gravely disappointed, pun intended there, because no attorneys general, nobody took him up on that. He was never able to. He was ready to try that case, and it never happened. And it could be because it was murder, maybe. Nobody wanted to charge a former president with murder. But in this instance down in Georgia, Chris, these are charges which ostensibly, I mean, they're not capital offenses, but Trump could definitely go to jail over that, couldn't he, or not?
Well, certainly they are charges, and particularly if you took the RICO, the racketeering charges, if they happen, that carry substantial prison time. Yes. I mean, it's not just Trump, by the way. There's 18 other people who have been warned by the Fulton County District Attorney, Fani Willis, that they are under threat of being charged as well. They're under investigation, that they're vulnerable to charges. Those include 13 members of there was an attempt by Trump or the people around him to create an alternative slate of electors out of Georgia who would go to the Electoral College and, rather than voting for Biden, would vote for Trump.
Yeah.
And amongst those who were members of that were members of the Republican members of the Georgia legislature and the chair of the state Republican Party. They've been warned that also was part of the conspiracy, and they could be charged. So it's there are a lot of potential charges floating around, and the list is quite interesting. But it's not clear who would be charged with what. But certainly, I think it's clear that Trump would be at the center of some of those charges, and on paper, at least. Yes, there's a risk of prison time for him.
Now, to review, the grand jury, secret grand jury, they've concluded their work. They've disbanded. They've asked that the findings of this be made public. And there's a timetable. The clock's ticking here, right?
Yeah, so later this month, there's a judge who will decide whether that report is made public. But meanwhile, in parallel to this, the district attorney, Fani Willis, will be deciding whether, on the basis of the report, I mean, it's a possibility, it seems unlikely given what we've heard, but there's a possibility that the they just decided not to recommend any charges at all. But if they have recommended charges, then she has to decide whether to press ahead with those charges, whether all of them or none of them. And if she decides to do that, then what she has to do is to convene a regular grand jury, put the evidence to them, and they hand down the indictment. That would be over a period of, well, it's not clear how long it would take for her to present that evidence, but it might be, it's not clear to me anyway, whether she just goes and gives them the report of the special grand jury and that's enough. It probably would be, I would imagine. But anyway, those charges could come down within a few weeks.
Well, I entitled this episode when I showed it around to people because, man, I got a lot of friends, and a lot of relatives that do not like Donald Trump. I said, 3 hots and a cot. Is that what they're looking at for Donald Trump? I mean, could he possibly go to jail? But really, more importantly, probably is the fact that these charges, the conviction, even if he doesn't spend a minute in jail, ostensibly prevent him from running for president. You can't have a conviction like this and run for president. Is that correct? Do you know?
Yes, you can.
Oh, you can.
There's nothing to stop him during all of this from running for president. And they, there have been a number of members of Congress actually who have been under investigation, have been charged, and who have run in recent years as well, and been elected. They have, on conviction, they have then resigned, but they have resigned under pressure rather than because the law. So, he if things went fast, he may well be sitting in prison in 2 years at the time of the election when he's re-elected, if he's re-elected. But I'm sure that this will be subject to a lot of appeals and all the rest, even if he were convicted. But potentially, there's nothing to stop him during this whole process from running for president.
Well, folks, we're talking to the great Chris McGreal, a friend of Podcast by George. He is with The Guardian. He's writing on the U.S. for them, traveling around the country. And really, that's got a lot to do with one of the reasons I like having you on the show, Chris. And I cover the Iowa caucuses a little bit when they're here. But, I mean, you're on this all the time. And yeah, I'm not a historian by any stretch. I can't tell you anything that happened more than 10, 15 years ago, probably. But what I do remember is the 2016 election run-up. And I remember right before the election, despite what all the pundits were saying, what all the great pollsters were saying, all the talking heads on cable. I mean, just a few days before the election, Hillary Clinton's got this. She's going to win by a big margin. Donald Trump doesn't have a chance or whatever. Well, some of the reporters on the ground, and I'm thinking most notably about the great Matt Taibbi. I think he may have been with Rolling Stone even back then, and also Michael Moore. They kind of popped their heads up and said, wait a minute, I'm reporting on this. I'm following this stuff. Now, it's anecdotal. It's not science, but my take is based on just the fervor, the enthusiasm that I'm seeing, the rallies and the size of them for Trump. This guy's got a shot. I mean, I think he could win. Michael Moore in particular started screaming and telling everybody to vote. My God, he's going to win. And in fact, of course, he did in 2016. Okay, long explanation, a long lead up to a question, but just your feel on the vibe, what's out there in the countryside, the parties that you're talking to, the leaders in the Republican Party in that time. Is Trump the guy? Is he going to be the nominee in 2024? And do you have any sense as to who's going to win this thing?
Yeah, but just before I answer that, I should actually qualify my last answer, which to say, of course, if he were to be elected, there's nothing, and be a criminal, of course, he could be impeached and removed from power. So, it's not like he would just be sitting there untouched.
Yeah, okay.
It's just there's no legal bar to him running. But yes, well, I mean, it's a great question. I think, there were unique circumstances in 2016. I think Hillary Clinton was an exceptionally weak candidate for reasons that we now know. Trump wasn't as well known, perhaps, as he should have been, and he has now been revealed to a lot of voters. That said, in 2020, his vote went up, albeit not by enough to beat Biden. But my sense is that even some of the most ardent Trump supporters feel that the time has come for a different candidate. I think partly because they fear he will lose, that he now comes with just too much baggage, and these investigations may, add to that baggage, and they are afraid of losing. I speak to Republican Party county chairs about this quite often, and they say that their parties are often split, that there's a number of people that have abandoned Trump for DeSantis, but they also make the point that Trump supporters tend to be the most vigorous, the most enthusiastic, those who will fight hardest. So they don't write him off, particularly in the primaries. And it is quite a long path. We do have a long way to go. And the other point they make is that DeSantis is really quite untested. I mean, yes, he's popular in Florida, but nobody's seen him on a national stage. Nobody's seen him campaign. He seems quite a cold fish in many ways. And, I was a rally with Donald Trump in Ohio in the midterms, the day before the elections down in Dayton. And, it's an amazing thing to watch him whip up the crowd. And, at one point he's talking about, windshield wipers and how they don't really last very long. And you think, what on earth has this got to do with anything? Yeah. People loved it. And he can fire people up in a way that you rarely see any politician do. So I know I'd be loath to write him off, but it's true. He is damaged goods, and he's damaged goods within the Republican Party. So it certainly presents a big challenge. At the same time, we should also add it's no easy path for DeSantis, is it? Because he wants to claim the Trump mantle, but how is he going to do that? By stabbing the king in the back? That's not necessarily the way to win the support in the primaries, in particular, of the people that supported Trump. So I think DeSantis has a very difficult path to navigate, where he claims to be the natural successor to Trump, whilst Trump, if he does stay the course, and isn't sitting in prison, does stay the course, then presumably it will be a very vicious fight, and we know how hard Trump can fight.
Yeah, and we know how good he is at using the media, and it's great that you mentioned that. And does DeSantis have that ability? I mean, I refer to Trump all the time as Captain Butt Crunch on my show. I don't like the guy, and he is a game show host. I mean, he is a media maven. I mean, he knows how to use the media. The media uses him. It's a reciprocal relationship that works out quite well for Donald Trump, and whether or not DeSantis has that same ability could be the thing that makes the difference. Let me bring this up on screen now. This I have viewers that they can text these questions. This is Mary Knox. She's a friend of Podcast by George. She's a great political astute observer. I want to read this for you, Chris, and get your take. Donald always talks like a mobster. She says, if I recall Paul Jay's theory of the attempted coup, that's what Paul talked about on my show. Before January 6th, Trump attempted to insert false electors into the certification of election results at the state level, and this occurred in several states. Chris mentioned that. Now, that plot was devised by Giuliani and Steve Bannon and others that makes Stop the Steal a crime. Others have argued there is no such thing as a false elector. So who certifies electors? How did we prevent such a scheme? It looks like she ran out of words there for her text, but yeah, I mean, that's that gets to a lot of it, I guess, and it has to do with these false electors in this process, and that's all what's on trial down there in Georgia.
Yeah, well, in the case of Georgia, what you saw was Giuliani go to the state legislature and argue essentially for them to override, which they apparently have the authority to do, the slate of electors. And his argument, he came up with all kinds of spurious evidence, supposedly, that had been fixed, including a claim that lots of teenagers under the voting age had voted, which wasn't true. And that the Dominion voting machines were rigged in some way, which is, of course, the subject of a very large lawsuit by Dominion against Fox News, amongst others. Those claims and others cost Giuliani his law license in New York. A New York court took it away in part on the grounds that he lied about these issues to the Georgia legislature and in other circumstances. So he's widely discredited on that. They then put together this slate of electors, which they tried to push forward to Congress, but it hadn't been endorsed by the state or the state legislature. So in that sense, I think that is evidence, at least it would appear that the district attorney of Fulton County intends to use that as evidence of a conspiracy to, fix the result, that these were not a legitimate. Otherwise, anybody could just declare themselves to be a slate of electors and turn up in Congress, right? Because nobody had given them the authority, and certainly not the state legislature.
Well, we got to wrap it up here. We got to let Chris go, and he's going to be a busy man as always here as we come up to another presidential election. Are you following what's happening in Iowa again, Chris? You know that the DNC has pulled first in the nation status away from the Iowa caucuses. Now that's under appeal, under protest. We may go rogue. Hell, who knows? The Republicans here say they're going to go first in Iowa with their caucuses regardless. So from your perspective, from The Guardian, are you going to cover Iowa like you have in the past, or are you going to move on? What's going to happen? What's your sense of that?
Well, I suppose it depends. Are they first in the nation? If they're first in the nation, yeah, we carry on as before. If not, I guess we have to look at what the circumstances are. Now, if they're first in the nation for the Republicans and not for the Democrats, then obviously we'll be covering, particularly given what we've just been talking about, will be, very closely covering at least the Republican caucuses. I just think the circumstances will dictate what happens.
Well, that's a great point to make. Again, I mentioned Stephen Schmidt, the professor up at Iowa State University, Dr. Politics, they call him here in Iowa, and he speaks fluent Spanish, maybe another, I think, German also, and he talks to all of the news agencies from around the world about the Iowa caucuses, and the point that he makes is if the Republicans do go first and the Democrats don't, I mean, they're idiots. I mean, because people like you will be coming into the state to cover the Republicans. I mean, it's free media. Take advantage of it. You would be foolish not to. So let's see what happens. Well, like I said, that's going to wrap it up for this particular episode. I love having you on the show, Chris. It was great to have you come back. Anything here you want to say in closing? I'll give you the last word on this particular live line on Podcast by George.
Oh, no, not really. Lovely to be back. And, it's going to be a long road to 2024.
Yeah, and we'll see you on the road, but if it leads to Iowa, I won't see you at a Hickenlooper rally, but I will see you here in Iowa. Chris McGreal, all your travels, pal. Travel safe, travel well.
Thank you.
And folks, I hope you like seeing Chris McGreal on Podcast by George, because the way that I put it is you got to subscribe. You got to go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up. It's free. And you'll get these live streams and video on YouTube or Facebook, if that's what you like to do. If you like to just listen to them, you can sign up and get them on Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, and of course iTunes and places like that. Let's put his little icon back up on screen here and read his outro here. Chris McGreal writes for the Guardian U.S. He's a former Guardian correspondent in Washington, Johannesburg, and Jerusalem. He's the author of American Overdose, the opioid tragedy in 3 acts. And maybe we'll revisit that at some point in the future with Chris, because that tragedy may be going into more than the 3 acts. Maybe it's going to go into an epilogue. I mean, that's continuing here in the United States, and that Sackler trial and the settlements and all that kind of stuff. He's got a great book. Check that out. It's American Overdose, the opioid tragedy in 3 acts. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up, folks. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.